It is 8:59 in the West. It is 11:59 in the East, and it is the Friday, April 15th edition of Lunch with Lincoln. I'm your host today, Reed Galen, co-founder of the Lincoln Project, and I am humbled to have joining me today Ambassador Steven Pifer. Ambassador Pifer was ambassador to Ukraine from 1998 to 2000. Is an expert on Russian and American relations. Is an insider and was in Ukraine in late January before the invasion, and hopefully can lay out for us exactly what's going on over there. Before he became a William Perry Fellow at Stanford University, he was a retired Foreign Service officer with more than 25 years at the State Department, focused on Eastern Europe, as I said, as well as arms control and security issues. Served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, and also Special Assistant to the President and Director for Russia and Ukraine and Eurasia on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. And it served at the U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as delegations to the negotiation on intermediate nuclear forces in Geneva. And Ambassador, your bio is so long and distinguished. It's been great having you. So we'll see you next time. No, I'm just kidding.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for joining me today, Ambassador. So first question. So you were ambassador to Ukraine not that long after it became an independent country after the fall of the Soviet Union. So for the viewers out there who don't know much about Ukraine other than what we're seeing in the last couple of months, take us back to a little bit of historical perspective on Ukraine as a country, Ukraine as a region. It's sort of crossroads, on this awfully bloody highway of the last 100, maybe 200 years.
Right. Well, I'll give you the short version of the history, because if you're actually talking about the history of Russia and Ukraine, you have to go back 1,000 years. And that may be one of the problems of Mr. Putin's vision of Ukraine. But Ukraine was one of the republics which was pushing for independence from the Soviet Union back in 1990 and 1991. And in 1991, immediately right before the Soviet Union officially collapsed, that was when Mikhail Gorbachev turned over the keys to Boris Yeltsin of Russia. They had a referendum in Ukraine where 91% of the population voted for independence.
Right.
When I got there in early 1998, Ukraine was struggling. Their economy was in trouble, but they had put in place sort of the basic workings of a democratic system. It still had a ways to go, and they were striving to build an independent country. There were tensions with Russia, but at that point in time, 25 years ago, I don't think Ukrainians really foresaw what happened in 2014 when the Russians seized Crimea and got involved in the war in Donbass. And then when they, of course, launched the war, the invasion that we've now seen in the last 2 months in 2022. But they were struggling to develop. But what you saw in Ukraine, I think, was a desire to be a democratic state. And you saw Ukrainians take to the streets in the Orange Revolution in 2004 to protest a stolen election. They also, I think, want to be a normal European country like Slovakia. And you saw that in 2013 and 2014 with the Maidan Revolution, which was originally triggered because the government decided not to go ahead and sign an agreement that would have brought the Ukrainians closer to the European Union.
Right. Well, and so just, they talk about Ukraine has been, I'll call it a nation, I guess, not necessarily a country, but a nation for 1,000 years, even since before Moscow was founded as a city. Right. Also, with let's just take it back, 80 years, 90 years, under the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, millions of Ukrainians were intentionally starved. During World War II, the Germans came through from the West. They thought, okay, maybe this is a chance for our independence. The Germans started killing them. The Soviets come back through in 44, 45, start killing the Ukrainians again. I didn't realize this, Ambassador, too, that there was a pretty significant Ukrainian uprising at the end of World War II, where they were fighting for independence from the Soviet Union. And then you fast forward to the things that you talked about in the last 20 years, which also include, poisoning presidential candidates, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure. So it's not, for those of us who, have sort of kept an eye on it, but not really understood it, the Ukrainians have every reason to have been concerned about this long before 2014, as you said, when they had these referenda in places like Crimea and Donbass, where they said, "Oh yeah, we really want to be part of Russia." So there is a long and bloody history that I think the Ukrainians are basically saying, "Not again." Right?
Yeah.
Like, we're going to do whatever we can to stay free.
Now, this is one of the things that I don't believe that the Kremlin understood. Is that for many Ukrainians, this is an existential fight.
Right.
If they lose this war with Russia, they lose their democracy and they lose any chance of becoming that normal European state. And this is one of the things that, quite frankly, surprised me. If you'd asked me or any Western analyst 8 weeks ago, 9 weeks ago, the question being, would the Ukrainians fight if the Russians invaded? We just said yes, clearly. The Kremlin didn't seem to come to that conclusion, nor did the Russian military. They appear to think this is going to be a cakewalk. The Ukrainians report that the prisoners that they took from the Russian force that assaulted Kyiv in the first days of the war had only 3 days of rations. They thought it was going to be over within a week.
Right.
And it's really an astonishing thing to me that the Kremlin and the Russian military simply didn't understand that this was going to be a real war, that they were going to go against an opponent who was determined. I think what has surprised people is just how effective the Ukrainian defense has been. But the Russians should not have been surprised that the Ukrainians were going to fight.
So you mentioned a couple of times that Ukraine wanted to point towards the West. They wanted to be a full-fledged European nation. And we should remind folks too, this is not a small country. This is a country the size of Texas with 40 million people.
And it's a large country entirely in Europe.
Right. A thriving culture. I think an improving economy. I heard Ambassador, one of the, because the Russians' communications are so in the clear, as they say, that somebody, when a Russian guy was calling home to his mom and said, "We got here, the roads are so nice, the parks are beautiful, the cities are gorgeous." And it sounded a lot like when Soviet forces went to Germany in 1945, and they said, "Why did they ever come here?" Right.
Yeah.
But there's always been historically this paranoia in Russia about the West, that somehow the West wanted to take it over, where I think, you could make an argument the German invasion, but it wasn't like France's. Well, I guess Napoleon tried to take it over too. So maybe I'm making a counterfactual point here is the paranoia that we've seen out of the Russians for decades, maybe centuries, legitimate, or has it always been a pretense for wanting to expand, its borders and using this paranoia and protection as a pretense?
Well, that has always been sort of, if you go back to Muscovy hundreds of years ago, the way it's defended itself is by expanding its territory.
Right.
And you've seen now to Russia, which covers 11 time zones. But look, today, Russia has 4,400 nuclear weapons, more than anybody else in the world. I would note that Ukraine has 0 nuclear weapons. Back in the early 1990s, on Ukraine's territory was the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal.
Right.
And the Ukrainians chose to give that up in large part because Russia committed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity, and committed never to use force against Ukraine. Well, we see what those commitments led to.
Right. Well, so let me ask you this: is an ambassador, as an expert, on Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, why has it been so hard for let me call it the West to understand, the lessons of history, which is, if a bully is not confronted and stopped, their behavior will only metastasize. Why? This is like a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now, Ambassador, are lessons that are less than 100 years old. Why is it that our memory is so fleeting on this stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think in retrospect now, it's pretty much taken for granted in the West that the West should have pushed back harder, should have applied more sanctions on Russia back in 2014 to try to dissuade this. Although I'm actually not sure, we would have been successful. This really is a war caused by one man. My guess is that the Russian general staff is not happy about this war. And they're less happy now about it than they were 8 weeks ago, because they're showing the world just how vulnerable they are in certain key areas.
Well, and they're also worried about ending up in the Lubyanka, I guess, too, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, failure is not going to be career enhancing for them.
No,
Uh,
or life enhancing for them.
but I think for Putin, I mean, you have to go back and read this 6,000 word essay he published last summer about Ukraine, or the hour-long speech he gave on February 21, 3 days before Russia launched the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
And you see a very distorted view of Ukraine. You see somebody who really doesn't accept the right of a Ukrainian state to exist as a sovereign entity. And he presents a history of Ukraine that very few historians would actually agree with. So there's this very distorted view that Putin has, I think, and that's a big driving factor in this war. And it's been I mean, I would have just one comment. I mean, I think in Moscow, there is this concern that Ukraine is moving away from Russia. It's moving out of the Russian sphere of influence. It wants to be in the West. But what I'm not sure they understand in Moscow is nothing has done more to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West than what the Russians have been doing since the last 8 years, since the seizure of Crimea. In late 2014, I was in Kyiv. This was after the Russians had seized Crimea and got involved in the war in Donbass. And that war in Donbass had killed 14,000 people by the beginning of this year.
Right.
This Ukrainian says to me, he says, Vladimir Putin has succeeded where centuries of Ukrainian nationalists have failed.
Right.
He's created a sense of national identity in this country, and he's imbued it with a strong anti-Russian sense. And that's only triple down with what the Russians have done in the last 8 weeks.
Well, and this is the other part too, which is, look, we're 50 days into this war.
Yeah.
Who knows? We don't know what direction it's going to go. We don't know how this will end up. But it's hard to imagine, Ambassador, that even, let's say, that the Russians were to succeed militarily, and what I mean is defeat Ukrainian armed forces, that there is not a long, sustained, bloody, draining, not insurrection. What's the word I'm looking for? Resistance that because they've turned so many of these cities into Stalingrad, they've created thousands, maybe tens of thousands of snipers' nests and javelins nests. That's never going to leave these guys alone.
No, Reed, you're exactly right. I mean, assume the best case. I mean, assume the Russians achieved what it looked like they were originally hoping to achieve when they invaded Ukraine from 5 different directions, and it was very clear that Kyiv, taking the capital, was their number one objective. Say they took Kyiv, say they take 2/3 of Ukraine, they're going to find themselves having to occupy a restive, angry, hostile population, many of whom will be armed for years, if not decades. Moscow will be politically isolated, and they're going to have these sanctions continue to decimate the Russian economy. The prediction from the World Bank is that this year the Russian economy will contract by 11% as a result of Western sanctions. And that's the victory scenario. So this is where, it's very difficult to understand what the Kremlin is hoping to achieve here, because even in the scenario where they so-called win, and I put that in quotation mark, that's going to have huge costs for Russia, and they will never, I think, subdue Ukrainians.
I mean, let me ask an oversimplified question, because I'm probably an oversimplified guy, Ambassador. If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, would it be that much different than, say, Saudi Arabia, just a petrostate with one guy in charge?
Yeah, no, I mean, if Russia did not have a large nuclear arsenal, if it had no nuclear weapons, it would not be getting the attention from the world that it gets. Which is one reason why I think Vladimir Putin talks so much about nuclear weapons, because I think he understands that's one of the few claims that Russia still has to superpower status.
I mean, I worked for President George W. Bush, Ambassador, and I remember going to it would have been the 2001 G8 summit in Genoa, Italy.
I was there too.
I was an advance man, so I promise you, I was building a stage while you were doing far more important work. But it was the G8. Russia had been included, not because it was an economic. It certainly wasn't the 8th largest economy in the world. It wasn't a democracy either, but only, I think, because of, maybe if we bring them into the tent in these sorts of discussions, maybe they'll act better. It seems like Germany thought that too. If we create a good trading partner, a symbiotic somehow economic relationship, that they'll act better. But that's just not been the case.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there was a sentiment in this. I worked in the White House during the Clinton administration, And as we were moving to enlarge NATO, President Clinton also wanted to try to build a cooperative relationship with Russia, a NATO-Russia relationship. And the idea was make that so cooperative that the Russians wouldn't care about enlargement because they would see NATO as a security partner. And that was also part of the idea about bringing Russia into the G8, which was, I think, in 1996 or 1997. And that idea, even though arguably, it was not one of the larger economies, and it certainly wasn't not yet an established democracy, but there were hopes to try to bring Russia into the West, and that might change it. And I think when Vladimir Putin came to the presidency in 2000, he had different things in mind. Early on, my guess is Putin wanted to have a good relationship with the West, but on his terms.
Right.
And those terms, I think, were just terms the West could not accept. And then he turned away from the West, and now we see that he's really set off, I think, on a course that's actually going to be quite destructive for Russia.
So I want to ask a couple of questions. One is about Russia, which is, I think at the beginning of the war, there was this sense that this was Putin's war, but it wasn't Russia's war.
No.
Do you believe that that's still the case? Do you think that this is the war of one man, or do you think there's an increasing number of Russian citizens who are now like, well, we're in this war, we're going to go take back what's ours?
Well, I think we need to bear in mind that the Kremlin really controls the information space in Russia. Mm-hmm. So your average Russian who's watching television or reading the main newspapers is getting a very distorted view of what's going on. He's not reading about large numbers of Russian casualties. He's not reading about Russian retreats from Kyiv. And when he reads about the destruction of Mariupol or what happened in Bucha, it's all fake news.
Right.
And there's also, I think, a certain rally around the flag syndrome, which you're seeing in Russia. So polling shows that Russians are supportive of Putin in the war. But I guess the question is, does that last as two things happen? First of all, as the impact of the economic sanctions, and you're already seeing an acceleration in Russian inflation, it will soon be in double digits. And as the economy contracts and as factories begin to shut down, reportedly including the main Russian factory that produces their tanks, because they can't get Western imports, including things like chips for their computers, as the economy begins to tank, and as they begin to see more and more Russian soldiers come home killed in action, does that begin to erode that support? Now, the Kremlin's built a very autocratic system in Russia. I mean, it really is reminiscent of Soviet times.
Right.
But the Kremlin also does a huge amount of polling. They're very sensitive to where the public mood is. And if the public mood should begin to turn against this war, that may be a factor that the Kremlin can't ignore.
But do you think that, I guess my question would be, if there were people who were afraid, if there are still people in Vladimir Putin's immediate orbit who were either ignorant to what the situation on the ground was in Ukraine, which seems hard to believe given their, the place was probably infested with Russian officers and agents. Is anyone going to be willing to take the polling in and say, Mr. President, you were at 70 a week ago and now you're at 30? Like that seems, nobody wants, it's a shoot the messenger culture.
This is, I think, one of the problems of the system that Putin has built is he operates in a very closed circle.
Right.
That inner circle consists largely of people who, like Putin himself, came out of the security services.
Right.
So they share a worldview. It's not clear that they're getting a wide range of information. So, for example, the head of the Russian central bank, she's a very smart economist. She knows what's going to happen to the Russian economy in the coming months. Likewise with the Russian finance minister. There's no evidence I've seen in the last 8 weeks that they've had any chance to talk to Putin and explain this to him. And then you get to the point, which is exactly right, is anybody prepared to give the boss bad news? Mm-hmm. There's this story of a Russian intelligence officer named Beseda who has been arrested. He was in charge, apparently, of providing the Kremlin with intelligence about Ukraine. And so my question is, did Beseda just not understand Ukraine and sort of told Putin, it's going to be easy, boss? Or did he understand Ukraine and understand how hard it was going to be, but didn't want to give that bad news to the boss? Right. And that's a real vulnerability of the system that Putin's created. But I think bad news is intruding. We're now in 8 weeks of the war. They haven't taken Kyiv. They've had to retreat from Kyiv. They're nowhere near Odessa in the west. They're preparing for a major offensive in the Donbass area, but there are real questions about how successful they're going to be. And of course, yesterday, the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, sank after apparently being hit by 2 Ukrainian anti-ship missiles. That news has to be seeping through to Putin. And I think at some point he has to understand this is not going the way he expected it to go.
Well, that's true. And before I bring it back to the U.S. and the West, I just want to ask one more question on the military strategy, which is it seems like that they thought that this was going to be a war like 1944-45. They were going to roll in with columns of tanks and armored vehicles and infantry and aircraft, and it was just going to be easy. What they didn't realize was, maybe it was a bazooka or a Panzerfaust in 1944-45, which were marginally effective if you could get close enough. The technological assets that the West has provided are so lethal and so effective that you see these Russian columns just being decimated. Not to mention the lack of maintenance and everything else that the American military is sort of almost obsessive about. And the Russians didn't appear to, they weren't filling up the tires, they weren't turning the engines over. Like, it's just ridiculous. So it seems like that they were using an 80-year-old sort of theory of military, a 80-year-old military theory that also, in addition to their unexpected nature of the Ukrainian resistance, just this wasn't an army prepared to do this.
I think that's right. I would add in one additional factor, which is corruption. Right. We always had the sense that there was corruption in the Russian defense sector, and maybe we're seeing that now. For example, there was a story that said the Russians, particularly after the conflict with Georgia in 2008, they needed to update their communications. So they apparently bought 60,000 radios for encrypted communications for Russian army units, and they don't work.
Right.
So the Russian commanders are back on their cell phones talking in the open. And my guess is they don't work because a lot of that money went to buy somebody's super yacht. Right. And as you're seeing these things come, what we're finding is, the Russians, to the surprise of the Kremlin, and I think also to the surprise of many Western military analysts, given the amount of money that the Kremlin put into modernizing Russian conventional forces over the last 10 or 12 years, there really have to be questions where all that money went.
Right.
And then on top of that, you have very questionable tactical. So let me say I'm not a military person, but for example, you don't send an armored column into an urban area that's not supported by infantry, precisely because you have to worry about small groups of guys with Javelin anti-armor missiles. It's been, I think, a surprise to people that there hasn't been, even though the Russian Air Force is much larger than the Ukrainian Air Force, the Russian Air Force still hasn't shut down the Ukrainian Air Force to the place where it can completely dominate the skies over Ukraine 8 weeks into the war. And second, you're not seeing much Russian air action to support forces on the ground. And then it's only 1 or 2 aircraft.
No, it's really just punitive bombing.
Punitive bombing, but again, it's a kind of a question, and somebody suggests maybe these operations are just too complex in terms of the combined arms and air-ground operations that the Russians haven't been able to master it. But it's certainly things that I think are probably a surprise to officers in NATO who are watching this and assume that, in fact, the Russians would be fighting at a much different level of competence than they've shown to date.
Well, and I think, listen, we spend an extraordinary amount of money on our military, our defensive capabilities. I think the Chinese do too. In addition to NATO, but also to your point, I think that our forces, first of all, it's an all volunteer army where the Russian is largely conscript, I think, right? And these are 18-year-old guys, and they're there for
about a third of the enlisted forces conscript now. Yeah.
And they get the conditions are awful, and the pay is zero, and the food is disgusting. Let me turn back to the U.S. though.
Actually, let me make one other point. I think there's one other point here that is also important, which is, and actually we started this when I was in Kyiv at the end of the 1990s, is we started training the Ukrainians to build a non-commissioned officer corps.
Sure.
U.S. Army, it's the NCOs, it's the senior sergeants who really, run things.
Sure.
And the Soviet military had none of that.
Right.
The Ukrainians modernized. They created NCOs. They gave more authority to their junior officers.
Right.
In a way that the Russians haven't. And so I think you've had on the Ukrainian side, even though they have inferior equipment and smaller numbers, but they have people who are much more tactically adept. They're prepared to exercise authority, and they're prepared to take the initiative. And that's given the Ukrainians a significant advantage in some of these fights with the Russians.
Well, and to your point on the morale front, they're fighting for their homes and their families, and they look behind them from whatever, foxhole they're in, and they see what's happening to their country, and they're like, not on my watch. Right.
Exactly.
And I don't think that is calculable. I don't know what exactly the calculus is, but it is very powerful. So let me ask you about, from your perch and your experience, both in Ukraine, at the White House on the NSC, and your various positions in national security organizations, and now at Stanford. This is going to be an unfair question. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Give us a grade. Give NATO a grade. Give the Western democracies a grade. How have we done so far?
I would give the West probably about an A minus.
Okay.
I think what we've seen, and I'll give the Biden administration a lot of credit for this, and in part because it's not visible. But beginning in December, they did the painstaking diplomacy. You had Secretary Blinken going to Europe every 2 or 3 weeks. The president was doing virtual meetings with NATO, with European Union leaders, with the G7. And there were hundreds of calls between Washington and Brussels to talk to NATO and the EU, between European capitals. And they did that in December and January. And I think they laid the basis so that when the Russians actually invaded, you saw NATO come together in a way that surprised Moscow.
And probably not since its founding, right?
I think it's, this is one where there was this is a wake-up call, and NATO has responded. And you've had the activation, for example, of the NATO response force, reinforcement of NATO military presence in places like the Baltics and Poland to do two things. One is to signal to those countries that, we're going to reassure you NATO will be there, but also to signal Moscow that NATO will defend NATO territory. Right. And then the other thing that I think caught the Russians by surprise was the severity of the sanctions. In particular, sanctioning the Russian central bank. For years, Putin has seen having a large stock of foreign reserves as a real asset and his ace in the hole if Russia ever became subject to sanctions. Yeah. And beginning of February, the Russian central bank had $630 billion in foreign reserves. Unfortunately for the Russians, is about half of that was parked in Western financial institutions. That's all been frozen now. The Russians can't get access to it.
Right.
And again, I think a lot of those sanctions just caught Moscow by surprise. Again, it's just one more in a long line of miscalculations the Kremlin has made in this escapade.
Well, and with the exception, I assume, of places like China or Syria or other rogue states or the black market, nobody's taking payment for anything in rubles anytime soon, I don't think.
Well, the Russians are trying to force that. They're telling the Europeans now, if you want our gas, you're going to have to pay us in rubles. And the Europeans are saying, look at the contract, read it. It's denoted payment will be made in dollars or euros. Right. And the Russians have already tried to make a couple payments in rubles, which I think technically will, within a month or so, put them in default. And that will have huge implications for the Russian economy in the future.
So speaking of the future, as we wrap up here, Ambassador, no one, the thing about war is that once you step off on the front line, nobody knows how it's going to go. No, any historian, right, will tell you, like, once the first shot is fired, nobody knows how it's going to go. No one knows how long it's going to take. But if you had a hazy, admittedly, crystal ball, one, how long does this take? And then two, what does the reconstruction of Ukraine look like? Because this is a country, again, a thriving, young, imperfect democracy, but all democracies are imperfect, that will need billions, if not trillions of dollars in immediate Western aid that will take decades to finally take effect. What does that look like in your mind?
Yeah, well, first, ideally in the Kremlin, they come to recognize that the costs of this misadventure far outweigh whatever political objective Putin had, and they decide to call it quits and they leave. That's hard to see at the moment. The Ukrainians have made clear they're prepared to negotiate. They're not going to give away the store, but they are prepared. I think Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is truly pained by the number of Ukrainians who are getting killed each day. He would like to end this war. But in Moscow, there's been no sign that the Kremlin that Vladimir Putin are prepared to negotiate seriously. They still think that they can achieve victory on the battlefield. I hope very much, and I believe that the Ukrainians can prevail in this. But the problem is that may take weeks or months. I mean, you may get into a situation now where it's just a slug it out stalemate between the two sides that could drag on and on and on until one side finally calls it quits. And at the end of the day, I don't think that's going to be the Ukrainians. I think Ukrainians see this as existential. Now, rebuilding Ukraine, it's going to be hugely expensive. I hope the Ukrainians are thinking about this, and I hope people in the West. For example, there are $300 billion in Russian central bank assets frozen in the West. I think a good portion of that should be devoted to helping Ukraine rebuild, because this immense destruction, hundreds of billions of dollars at a minimum, has been caused by the Russian military in a war that was not provoked and had no justification whatsoever.
And in your diplomatic history, are there people thinking about that now?
Yes, there are indeed. And again, there are some examples in the past where assets had been frozen and then had been seized for other purposes. And this, I think, is a case where that would be very much merited. Again, the Russians are not going to willingly contribute to the reconstruction of Ukraine, but maybe they can make an unwitting donation.
Last question before I let you go. Are you surprised how quickly Western democracies lined up and locked arms?
Maybe a little bit, but I think just the brutal nature of the war, the fact that it was unleashed on Ukraine in the eyes of pretty much everybody who steps back and takes it with no real justification. I mean, Vladimir Putin talks about, well, it's a Nazi regime. The government of Ukraine is headed by a Jewish president.
Right.
And I think the West was appalled by that. And to the extent that people maybe over the last 15 years didn't want to see where Vladimir Putin was going, now have a clear understanding. I mean, I don't think people like the prospect, but they understand that this is a country that has chosen to make itself an adversary of not just Ukraine, but of much of the West. And we're now going to have to accordingly adjust our policy and be prepared to push back against that.
No, that's right. It's funny. There's probably in Langley, Virginia, Ambassador, there's probably a whole bunch of phone calls going out to retired Russia hands going, hey, you want like a year-long contract? Because we might need your help.
Well, they've got both the National Security Council at state and at the Pentagon. They've got very smart people about Russia. So I think they understand what they're dealing with. And again, I think the main shift is in Europe now. I think the Europeans now are getting a very clear-eyed vision of what they have to deal with, and we know what to do. I mean, it's kind of unfortunate that we have to go back to that history, but NATO was originally established to basically protect Western democracies from a threat to the East, and there's still that muscle memory. And I think you see NATO now gearing up, and we'll see at the summit in June how NATO chooses to respond, and perhaps this will be with the possibility too of Finland and Sweden applying to join.
Well, again, when it comes to warfare, the law of unintended consequences, the idea that Finland, that they're suddenly like, hey, yeah, sure, we'll come on in. And it's a fascinating thing. Well, listen, Ambassador, I want to thank you so much for your time. And again, everybody, Ambassador Steven Pifer, long experience, former ambassador to Ukraine. Want to thank you for joining me today. Before we let everybody go, we got a couple of videos that Felicia's teed up for us. So why don't we watch that, and then we'll let everybody get on. And I hope everybody out there has a happy Easter and a happy Passover.
What are you excited for?
I'm the secret body.
Trump.
I know you're having a great time at the Kid Rock concert tonight.
If you're a senator and you're voting to approve Ketanji Brown Jackson, then you are pro-pedophile.
Judge Brown is a pedophile apologist.
The last Judge Jackson left the Supreme Court to go to Nuremberg and prosecute the case against the Nazis. This Judge Jackson might have gone there to defend them.
Disney wants to completely take your children and they want to indoctrinate them into sexual immoral filth.
Do you see Minnie in a dress? Or do you see Mickey holding a penis?
Herschel Walker, the leading GOP candidate in the vital Senate race in Georgia. You endorsed him, yet his ex-wife says he pointed a pistol at her head and said, "I'm going to blow your effing brains out."
Almost every candidate's had troubled periods.
You got to remember that the song Michael Jackson said, "The man in the mirror." You got to look at yourself and see what's going on. You know, this country is this is one of the most environmental drilling countries in the world, but yet we're walking on all the resources we have underneath our feet.
Make it stop. It's awful.
If I think I'm the most honest human being, perhaps that God ever created.
I'm kind of confused why they're telling us to stand with Ukraine when it seems that everybody affiliated or standing with Ukraine is either a transgender, Satanist, or a straight-up Nazi.
Texas is providing charter buses to send these illegal immigrants who have been dropped off by the Biden administration to Washington, D.C.
One of the first January 6 trials ended in an extortion.
I'm Ron Hanks, and I'm running for the United States Senate. I'm Ron Hanks, and I approve this message.
Do you respect Putin?
I do respect him. I like Putin. He likes me. He's a leader. Okay. He's respected.
So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that?
President Putin is sharp. President Putin was a total gentleman. Putin called me brilliant. I like it. Of course he's smart. He is strong and he's tough. Putin even sent me a present. Beautiful present.
Here's a guy who's very savvy. I know him very well.
I asked you the last time you were on whether you think that this is evil in our time. Do you believe this is evil in our time?
I think in 100 years, people are going to look back and they're going to say, how did we stand back and NATO stand back, which in many ways I've called a paper tiger. Don't forget, I rebuilt NATO because when I became president, the first thing I noticed when I went there to the first meeting was that most of the countries were not paying for